So this particular political cartoon is another one that you're going to want to be especially familiar with. It's basically a one of the early cartoons by a man by the name of Thomas Nast. Nast is going to be famous for coming against the Tammany Hall and kind of Boss Tweed and that kind of thing, which will make more sense when we get to the Gilded Age. But he uses cartoons really kind of to depict ideas. Um, you really have a lot of people of varying degrees of literacy, especially up north, especially when you have immigrants. So even if they are literate, maybe they don't read English. And so Thomas Nast will create these political cartoons that really convey these very meaningful ideas. He's very much going to be kind of what we now term as progressive. So he will be a big ally as far as Teddy Roosevelt's concerned, kind of depicting, kind of attacking kind of the corruption that existed in New York in the late 1800s and that sort of thing. But in this particular case, this is one of his early cartoons. It's from 1861, and Thomas Nast is basically depicting the two perceptions of the inauguration. Um, the one on the left is a depiction of the North's reaction. Basically, they portray him with palm branches, a garland of peace. He's dressed as somebody who wants to bring a peaceful resolution, balance the scales between the North and the South. And that sort of thing. So that's kind of the message of what the North sees. If you look on the left, what you see is the Southern perception. The Southern perception is going to be one of a warrior standing over a vanquished foe. And of course, you can guess by the cat o' nine tails that the person on the ground has that is a slave owner. One says peace, one says war, and very clearly indicating that the president's inauguration is received very differently by different sections of the country. And you can see that based on the documents that we saw with the San Antonio Daily Ledger, that we saw with the secession documents, that we saw with Alexander Stevens' cornerstone speech. The South interprets the election of Abraham Lincoln as being, tantamount to an act of war. Now, we can ask ourselves whether or not that was a fair assertion. I mentioned earlier in one of the previous lectures that the South, had really kind of fed itself, recycled kind of information about what this election meant. And clearly that, what's happening is rather than trying to work with the administration, they recognize that they are not going to have the numbers to hold out much longer. And that the Republicans will have zero interest in compromise. And so they kind of react, very defensively, if you will. And so that's how we end up going to war. And of course, the North is going to not see that. They're going to look at Lincoln's words, and they're going to trust that he's true to them. And I think Lincoln would have been true to his word. The issue here is that history was coming against the South. The industrialization was taking over. The Southern system was not going to hold out. And politically, the South was starting to lose its mojo, if you will. They were no longer able to really kind of dictate policy the way they did in the late 1700s, early 1800s. Now they are having to be reactionary, trying to preemptively stop any kind of changes and that sort of thing. So I think it's very important for you to kind of recognize the different perspectives. This particular political cartoon will also be very important in your Eastfield objective essay. So being able to kind of layer that, depiction of the two different opinions with especially Alexander Stephens' cornerstone speech and kind of understand it within the whole scope of these 1860 documents, I think that will help you quite a bit. The last document I'm going to talk about is going to be Abraham Lincoln's special session message, July 4th, 1861. He basically has to get Congress to pay for the war, so he calls a special session of Congress in order to do this. And he starts out pretty forcefully. You can see that he basically talks about they, right? So who is they? They to Abraham Lincoln are people like Alexander Stephens, Jefferson Davis, the leadership of the Confederacy. He sees that Southern power conspiracy as being the driving factor, that ordinary Southerners would not secede if they were not being egged into it, egged on, if you will. So he's really kind of laying the blame at the feet of the quote unquote Southern power structure. Now, like I said, and I've mentioned this before, I think he's a little bit naive about exactly how ingratiated this system of slavery is to everybody's mindset, everybody's sense of, aspiration and opportunity. I mean, it's all based on being able to own slaves. But I think Lincoln doesn't see it that way, nor do I think he wants to. So he very quickly talks about, should we call this secession or should we call it rebellion? And then he goes into saying, well, they had to change it to secession because they knew that ordinary people in the South would never support something that was a violation of the law. Again, probably a little bit idealistic. Maybe he's got something to that. Alexander Stephens certainly hinted that there was a little bit of controversy, that there were some people that were uncomfortable with secession. So maybe there is something to this. I don't know that it's enough to it to basically not have the Civil War. But I think that it's interesting that he points out that they had to kind of go call it by a different name, if you will. So be sure you have an understanding of who they is, or who is they. That sounds a whole lot better, doesn't it? Why Lincoln is kind of taking this perspective, and then he really is calling it rebellion, right? He's not calling it anything else. He also goes on, there's a word he uses in this paragraph called sophism. That vocabulary word might be a little bit unfamiliar. Sophism means logic, right? If it's sophistic, it's, this is where we get the idea of sophisticated from. It's a logical, complex kind of way of thinking, that sort of thing. Not logical. It is a complex logic. That's how I meant to say that. And so they invent this sophism, right? This logic argument that is complex and complicated, that basically says, hey, we're destroying the Union, but it's because, it's secession, it's not rebellion. And we can do this lawfully and peacefully, and no one has to shed any blood. And that it's basically a lie, right, is what he's saying. That they have kind of stretched this lie out. Going into the next paragraph, he lays the original blame for this lie in 1832 with that South Carolina Exposition and Protest from the nullification crisis. And he says, they had begun sugarcoating this and poisoning people's minds in the South, 30 years ago, beginning with John C. Calhoun. And that's probably true. They did. So I think he's very accurate there. And that basically this whole thing is a farce, right? It's a farce that they would even attempt to kind of justify this sort of thing. And, so I think that that's a really important point. The last part of it, takes this idea. Basically, he says this logic, this complicated theory, assumes the assumption that each state has its own power, right? And he says, no, each state does not have its own power. The federal government has power, and the states have neither more nor less power than reserved to them by the Constitution. So to say that the states have more power in order to bust apart the United States is false, right? They don't have more or less than what the Constitution gave them. And of course, in previous speeches, he's already kind of laid out this logic with the Constitution. He makes the exception that only Texas could possibly, because it was temporarily independent, and was never designated a state. But then he goes on to say that when it decided to become a state and accept the Constitution, it therefore, accepted, that supremacy of the law. And so he goes into, again, reiterating this idea of the United Colonies, that being united came first. Therefore, this argument that, in colonial times we were all independent, free. He's like, no, that's not how that works, right? So kind of an echo back to his inaugural address. And so I think it's very important to kind of recognize that he's calling out this kind of lie, this kind of logic, and really kind of poking holes in it. So when you look at kind of the attitudes of the South, you can see where, there was a lot of bad information being spread around and a lot of things that people wanted to believe to be true. So people just didn't want to listen to the truth of the matter in many ways. So you have him going in, having this conversation about what is the term sovereignty. You can't have, an idea of a sovereign political entity without a political superior. Again, he talks about Texas. He mentions basically the supremacy clause, that sovereignty can't exist because the supremacy clause in Article 6 says, hey, that, it just doesn't work that way. That the states never had a constitution independent of the United States, other than Texas, which of course then became the United States willingly. He goes into talking about this being a people's contest. On one side of the Union, it is a struggle for maintaining in the world a form and substance of government whose leading object is to elevate the condition of men, to lift artificial weights from all shoulders, to clear the paths of laudable pursuit for all, to afford all an unfettered start and fair chance in the race of life. He's talking about equality. That's essentially what he's talking about. Individualism, but for all people, that it's not just white men that get to have individualism. Now, I would suspect that he would have probably supported women, maybe not immediately, but he would have certainly seen women as kind of falling within that. He says, I am most happy to believe that the plain people understand and appreciate this. And he makes reference to the large numbers of leaders that had been in the Army and the Navy that had left the military to go south. So this is part of why the South is going to have, in the first couple of years of the war, some strength, because they have all these great military leaders. Now, they don't have the ordinary soldiers necessarily, nor do they have the resources, but they do have this kind of military expertise that helps them. And he kind of praises the ones that had remained and the ordinary soldiers that were still in the U.S. Army and that kind of thing. He goes into discussing on the next section that election results, that the appropriate way to respond is not essentially to throw a temper tantrum and create a revolution or rebellion or secession or whatever, right? That if you had that happening every time in a democratic society, if you had that happen every time you didn't like election results, you would not only have chaos, but you would have constant war, right? That their being mad at his election is unfair, and is not the way this thing works, right? I guess maybe unfair is the wrong word. That it's just not. There's nothing legal about it, right? That this is part of what having a democratic society is. We might do an analysis perhaps going back to the early 1800s with the questions that they had regarding the issue of democracy and how successful it was. And certainly the fact that Alexander Stevens kind of described a very kind of, British aristocratic system as far as the Confederate type of government. Maybe they didn't really trust democracy, but you certainly see that Abraham Lincoln is saying, we don't do it this way, right? That teaching men that they cannot take by an election, neither with it that what they cannot take by an election, neither can they take by war, right? You can't just start a war because you don't like the results of an election. And then, of course, this idea about he makes a reference to kind of Reconstruction, this idea that, hey, after the war, really what we need to do is get them back into the Constitution. So he kind of hints at what will be his long-term plan. And we'll see that by 1863, 1864, he's already pushing out his plan of Reconstruction. And it's very much along these same lines, keeping that power structure out of office, and then essentially, making it easier for ordinary citizens to come back in. He goes into saying that, that it is his responsibility, to basically fight this war, conduct this war. That he may not like it, but that's what he has to do. And then he goes on to say that there will be no compromise. That he cannot, whether he would want to or not, accept a compromise when you have people that are willing to go to war, right? And that's not how things work, right? That when the will of the people who elected him, and kind of what he believes, kind of what they believe in, that he can't just say, oh well, we're going to compromise and end this thing. So you have very early people questioning, well, why can't we just work this out? And then of course he makes a very clear plea to have money provided for the conduct of the war, which of course he will get. So that is his special session. Again, really kind of speaking to, reiterating some of the themes that you would have seen in his inauguration speech, as well as kind of really tearing down the idea of the Confederacy declaring war and what that means. So I think there's a lot we can learn about kind of the causes of the Civil War. Again, remember that your Eastfield objective essay will be about this particular topic, about what kind of drove this idea of misperceptions of, people, digging in. Really the question of democracy. Do we believe when we don't like what our government is doing, when we don't like what our government is saying, when we don't like the results of an election, what do we do, right? How do we handle that? Do we, try to rebel? Do we, try to stop functioning government? How do we do that? And I think that what you find out is that it's handled by civic activity, by being engaged voters, by getting out and voting, and by, shaping those opinions. Now, I do think that some of that requires congressional leaders that are willing to follow the will of the people. And sometimes I don't know that we have that. We certainly didn't in the 1850s. You had people very dug in, particularly those in the South, that wanted the government to be their way and their way only, and wanted to protect what they felt was their way of life against what they saw as being an attack on their way of life. And this kind of dug in approach is what made that 1850s period, really 1840s too, being so difficult to get anything accomplished, and ultimately leads to when you have kind of the wheels of time and the feelings of people elect Abraham Lincoln. They just can't handle it, right? They can't handle that they're losing their grip on what the United States is becoming, and that it's believing in things that they don't support. So they'll go to war, even though Lincoln is trying desperately to convince them there's nothing to worry about. We can work this out. But there's no compromising with people that are willing to go this far. So you have to, I think there's a lot to that. And understanding kind of what Lincoln's inauguration meant. To one part of the country, it meant the failure of democracy. It meant a threat of tyranny. To another part of the country, it meant preservation. It meant, pursuing a course that would live up to the values and the ideals of the country. And what do you do when those opinions are so completely opposite? How could you possibly stop that? And what about the African Americans in the story? What about women in the story? We've seen a lot of the conversations in these documents, but none of them talked about women. We hear this accusation about equality. Stephen says, "Oh well, that this whole all men are created equal thing is false." You hear Lincoln make reference to, "No, we are a country that's all about equality," but neither one of them address women. And to what extent are they addressing African Americans? I don't know that you see Lincoln actually saying anything specifically one way or the other. Now, we know the secession documents and Stevens certainly kind of, are very critical of African American citizenship and voting rights and opportunity and all that kind of stuff. I mean, that's a no-brainer, right? But Lincoln is remarkably silent on the issue. Is that because we think that he's just trying to get everything taken care of, that he's trying to keep from, making things worse? Is it because he doesn't really think about it? I think it's very telling that in 1861, Lincoln has a lot of other things to worry about. He's got, in addition to the ordinary transition of being a new president, he's got to deal with this secession crisis or rebellion crisis or revolution or whatever term you want to call it. So maybe he just hasn't given it any thought. Maybe, there's certainly an indication from his stuff in 1850s that he was in the process of understanding exactly what African American rights were, what was right, what was appropriate. So this part of him is very much a work in progress, and I think that's part of why we don't see a whole lot of African American rights in this particular part. So I hope this kind of helps you understand the documents. If you have any other questions, please let me know. I think the other documents should be pretty clear because we did definitely in all the classes go through those documents. And of course, this will kind of help make it clearer for you.